My name is Lieutenant Colonel Troy Ogle. I'm an instructor pilot on the C-17 and I have 6,100 hours flying in the Air Force.
My name is First Lieutenant Jalen Anderson. I am a co-pilot on the C-17 and I have 800 hours. Right, so my role for Operations Allies Refuge was to serve as a co-pilot. So I was fortunate enough to be with a fairly experienced crew on the pilot side, have, Colonel Ogle, who is an instructor pilot, and then the other Colonel Talley that we were with, he was also an instructor pilot and also a weapons graduate. But essentially, I was to back them up in the procedures that we had to go through, as well as maintaining safe operation of the airplane.
And the role I had in the operation was, at that time, I was the 301st Airlift Squadron commander, but I saw this unfolding and I wanted to be out front and get involved early as I could. So I volunteered to get out on orders and offered my services as an aircraft commander, and we selected the crew. So Lieutenant Anderson and Lieutenant Colonel Mike Talley and I headed out as quick as we could. It wasn't quite a real smooth start, and we'll probably talk about that later.
When did I hear volunteers were needed? Essentially, as soon as I returned. So my story begins prior to OAR. I was out with an original crew where we were just serving an MPA tour, flying operations in and out of the deed. And unfortunately, my grandfather passed during the time, so I returned home on emergency leave. And upon getting back to Travis, I was literally in the squadron one day, walked in, and then that's when Lieutenant Colonel Ogle came by and said, hey, we're putting together volunteers for OAR. And I was like, well, my bags are still packed because I just got back home. So I said, sure, I would love to go back out, because I felt that my role was still out there just because I kind of saw the events unfolding as well.
And for the same answer as to when I heard about this, it was as the events started to just unfold, I knew that they were going to need more airlift. So I was already preparing in my mind that our squadron would probably be called upon to offer some crews to the OAR operation. And as soon as we got the opportunity to start putting crews together, so it was probably just, I think it was within a day or two, we had our orders and we're already getting tasked to fly out of Travis towards the east.
What did I do to prepare for this mission? For me, it was interesting in the fact that a lot of my family was still hurting from the loss of my grandfather. And looking back at it, I still had not quite gotten the opportunity to grieve. However, my grandfather being one who also served, I felt that it was my responsibility to continue to do what I volunteered to do in joining the Air Force in the first place. And my family being religious, they of course shared that they were praying for me. And that was something that I kind of carried with me. That and just the fact that I'm going to do this to honor my grandfather at the time. And fortunately, in terms of preparation, since I'd been out in the Middle East performing operations day to day, I felt almost overly prepared. So it actually worked out quite nice, because it was like, oh, well, I'm kind of familiar with the operations. We need to tune in here. We need to talk to these people. I know where to go. So ultimately, on the actual operation side, I was prepared. And then on the resiliency side, of course, there was my family that was kind of my rock during that whole process as well.
And for how did I prepare for the operation? I've been in the Air Force for over 22 years now. And we keep our currency and our proficiency just like the active duty member, the regular Air Force member. So we're always ready. That's our job, is to always be ready. So there wasn't really too much I had to do to have the skill set required. Right. And we each have a different little story. So Jalen, I know, was coming back for for the funeral of his grandfather. You know, I have a couple of young daughters, and this was probably the hardest time for them to say goodbye to their dad and for me to say goodbye to my daughters, because they're old enough to see the news and what's going on. And we've already had some fairly traumatic pictures shown on the TV at this point. And so it was pretty difficult to say goodbye. But I did, like Jalen mentioned, have the support of my family, our church, and a lot of people back home in the squadron, which hopefully you'll get to talk to a lot of those folks at a future point. But once we got paired up as a crew, then the resiliency kind of fell to being just part of our team, our crew, and taking care of each other. So I was looking out for Lieutenant Anderson, and he was looking out for me. He'd been out there flying this stuff, so he knew where to go, what window, what phone to call, which part of the airfield is most likely going to be where we need to head to. I've been over there many times before, but not in the last 45 days like Lieutenant Anderson had done. So it was a great matchup of people from all walks of life, experiences, and we put that together to get the mission done safely.
First days of the operation. Well, I'd say some of the first days there was a little bit of excitement because for me, this was my first major operation that I was a part of, and I recognized early on that I was a part of history, which there's an excitement factor about that, but then there's also the fear of the unknown because I'd never been in this situation before, so I consider this actual combat. You know, there's obviously danger from what I've seen on the news, so there was a lot of uncertainty. But also one of, at least my biggest concerns was in the training that I've done, will I be able to perform, or will I be able to be, you know, an actual, you know, valuable crew member for this crew as we perform a mission in which we don't normally prepare for, but we're also always prepared to adapt and be flexible overall. So I'd say that's how it was on the first few days. There was a lot of traveling in place, figuring out when we were actually going to go into Kabul, because we had to, of course, get from Travis, and then I believe our first destination was Ramstein, and then after Ramstein, it was kind of hurry up and wait. That whole aspect is, and we were like, hey, you know, we're here to help. Just let us know when can we get in the mission and start getting these people out. But that's what I recall as being some of the first days. It's just both the fear of the unknown and the excitement.
And to answer the question of how did the initial part of the operation go, you know, it was very big, right? There was many airplanes, many air crew, and we were just one part to this operation. So it actually took us 4 tries to leave Travis due to aircraft scheduling. At first, they were not able to handle us to the east, so they wanted us to wait here. And then we had at least one time that we had a maintenance issue on the aircraft, so we stayed here. So I believe on the 4th alert of the trip or the mission, we finally left Travis and flew to Riverside, March Air Reserve Base, and picked up another volunteer crew from the 729th Airlift Squadron down there. And then we flew to McGuire Air Force Base, picked up another reserve volunteer crew, and then all on that same day we made it to Ramstein, which is where we had our first chance to rest and get scheduled up for whatever was to come next. Now, we didn't know exactly what was to come. In this operation, it was using the stage, which a stage is trying to keep the aircraft and cargo moving as quickly as we can. So as an aircraft would come in, it would be scheduled for whatever it needed, whether it was fuel, maintenance, a new crew, download cargo, upload cargo, and then as fast as the mission could handle, it would take off towards its next destination. So we landed in Ramstein and basically sat for maybe a day or so and got set up for what took us into really our part and contribution to OAR. So we'll probably cover that in another question. But initially, it was a little bit of a rough start getting out of Travis, but we just kept after it, and finally we got the gear in the well and we're out of here.
Yep.
you're right. It was a very, very big operation. And how did we persevere and make this operation successful for us? I looked at it as something that I'm just a part of this operation, and I'm going to do the best that what I can and what our crew can do to do whatever we can in this humanitarian effort. You don't have to really ask for too many volunteers when the word humanitarian effort comes up. And so across the Air Force Reserve Command, we did have a lot of hands raised to volunteer. There are lessons learned on how we can do better, but just to see how willing people are to step forward and leave their families and their civilian lives to go and volunteer to do whatever they can was really a humbling part to be a part of this operation. I think one of the best, things or ways I was able to contribute to this operation was really just being flexible. I can remember an evening where it took forever to get to an airplane, and we'd volunteered to fly in the back of an airplane to go to another air station. And the plan changed, and by the time the plan changed to change 3 or maybe 4, we were 8 to 12 hours into the day, and we ended up flying that night over to Kabul, I believe.
Yes, we did.
And so we just stayed flexible and evaluated our fatigue and how the crew was doing and what they were asking us to do. And if we could be successful at that, then we just kept volunteering to do things like that.
Right. Some of the challenges that, looking back on, I believe we faced as a crew, Colonel Ogle already alluded to it, was the fatigue factor, and also I would add just understanding our role in the process. So, like I said, it was 8 to 12 hours on the day before we actually took off and headed to Kabul. This was our first time going in. And of course, you were given a sheet of paper saying, hey, this is what you're expected to do. This is how you get in the airport. This is who you communicate with, which was all great. But at the same time, no one had ever done this before. So we didn't know what to expect. But one of the things that I feel kind of helped was just the communication factor. So fortunately, the C-17 community, they kind of really came together and established a lessons learned aspect. So as crews were coming in and out, we were communicating with each other, saying, hey, what's the status on the ground? Or what can we expect when we get there? And it ended up being just a giant CRM exercise, something that the Air Force harps on constantly, is just using your crew and utilizing your resources. Well, if somebody's gone in and they just did it, then that's some valuable information there. And that became possibly my biggest tool in combating some of the challenges I faced, was other co-pilots who I went to pilot training with. Now we're all serving together in a major operation. We're now texting each other, communicating, saying, hey, I heard you just went in. Like, what was it like? What did you guys do differently? What would you suggest? And just getting that real-time feedback really helped speed the process along and helped me then take the information I was receiving, where Colonel Ogle he's the aircraft commander. He has some other things on his mind. Me as a co-pilot, I then began to establish my role as a valuable crew member as, okay, well, hey, this is what I heard. This is what we can expect. Oh, did you just hear what that guy said on the radio? That might be something that we can use. And it ultimately kind of slowed things down. In the process where it was go, 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 we really wanted to get in there. Somebody has to ideally, reel us back in and just like, hey, well, let's make sure we get everything checked out, cross our P's and Q's, and really execute this mission, because ultimately our number one priority was safety. We all wanted to return home to our families, and stepping up as a crew and everybody kind of leaning on each other during that process is ultimately what led us to, completing the mission and getting those people out of there.
Like Lieutenant Anderson mentioned, fatigue was an issue throughout almost every single duty day that we actually were on duty, just because of the pacing of things. And I was thinking of probably the second time we went into Kabul, when we were, switching airplanes.
Yeah.
But he's right. The first time we went into Kabul, we flew from Ramstein all the way down to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and got gas, and then continued on to Kabul and back. So that was right into our waiver duty day limit of 26 hours. Yeah, we just kept assessing our fatigue,
right.
And Lieutenant Anderson was on the spot with getting all the finer details of the airplane ready, while different crew members were working on getting the aircraft ready and configured. We'd kind of talked about how we were going to handle evacuees, and we did have some provisions that we didn't usually carry, like tarps to put on the floors, and we'd purchased food up in Ramstein to offer anything to somebody that might be in some sort of a bad way that needed anything of comfort, and to help them just for a few hours till they got to some place that had better facilities and support. And that ended up coming in very useful. But I think what Lieutenant Anderson is really getting at is everybody was an active participator on the crew. So all 3 pilots were doing separate things, all towards the same goal. The 2 loadmasters that we had were outstanding, and they were operating to get the back of the aircraft ready and configured. We also had a flight nurse who was prepared with her supplies to handle whatever might unfold in the back. We had 2 crew chiefs, and they were just super help getting the aircraft fueled, everything in order on the maintenance side of things. And we also had Air Force Ravens on board for support. And so that's a pretty big crew. It's much bigger than our normal number of 2 pilots and 1 loadmaster, or 3 pilots and 2 loadmasters. We had quite a few people on board, and it was just awesome to see the team work together to get through some of those big hurdles that were placed in front of us.
Right. So for security reasons, we tried our best to secure the cockpit. So we were all on headset, communicating constantly, like, hey, what's it looking like back there? And they're just giving us constant updates where it's like, oh, I think they're bringing the passengers. Oh, maybe not. But ultimately, we ended up, I think we barricaded the door just for security reasons, because at the end of the day, I know they were going through a screening process on, the passengers they were loading on, but there's still in the back of your mind, you have to ultimately protect the aircraft and protect yourself as well. So we were relying solely on the loadmasters, our Ravens, and then our crew chiefs. They all assumed the role, kind of as Lieutenant Colonel Ogle mentioned, is that everybody had their role in kind of how we're going to handle passengers. And those guys took care of security in the back, whereas we kept the airplane prepared. So as soon as we got those people on, we could get out and immediately get going, because time was critical, because as we would leave, another C-17 would be coming in. And that's how ultimately we were able to keep this whole process going, and how we were able to get as many people out as we could in a short amount of time. Yeah, that's what I got for that.
So how did the loadmasters help bring on the refugees in the back of the aircraft? We really only flew the 1 trip full of evacuees. Somewhere around 430 passengers is the best guess that we have. Lieutenant Anderson, Colonel Talley, and I were up front. It was nighttime. It was the night that the Marines had the bombing on the perimeter fence line. So the airfield was, kind of under attack to some extent, and there was quite a bit of, tracer rounds going up into the sky on the arrival. And so it was pretty chaotic. When we landed, they asked us to prepare the aircraft to unload the passengers. Then they immediately changed their mind and said, close the doors, secure the aircraft. And I think that happened at least twice before we actually were notified that it's time to load some passengers. So we are all up front with our professional gear on. I've got my helmet and my NVGs on, and I can see what's going on. I can see smoke. I can see different flashes of light and fire, but I can't really see the passengers coming on. I can see them going on to other aircraft, so I'm envisioning what it's looking like. So I really had to rely on the crew and communicating with the loadmasters on headset. But once we got the passengers coming on, pretty standard, I think, is how it happened with, you know, a long line of people. We tried to bring people in 10 at a time to get them packed in as tight as we can. Looking back, I think that if you would have somebody stand up instead of sit down, you'll be able to pack more people into an aircraft. As soon as people sit down, you tend to kind of take your space, and then you can't squeeze people in as much as if you had them standing, and then finally, you know, close the doors. But we kept loading and loading and loading and loading, and all 4 engines were running the whole time, so we were monitoring our fuel situation, trying to make sure we didn't overload the aircraft so that we could still take off. Right. And once we got the ramp closed, then we looked and assessed, and there was a little bit more room up the front, in the front area, so we had people up into the galley section of the aircraft. And you know, like I said, we didn't go downstairs very much, if at all, during that section until we were airborne. And then if we did need to use the lavatory, you know, you kind of coordinate to have somebody blocking the door for safety reasons. And when I did go down, there was people all over the entire floor. You can't see an inch of the floor. And when I tried to open the door to the bathroom, I can still remember a little kid's head just right up against the bathroom door. So he's sleeping, and I'm trying not to wake him up and disturb him, but I need to get him to use the restroom as well. So it was definitely different than our normal operation.
100% different.
Yeah, I don't think you probably won't ever see that again. That was the first time, 22 years of flying. I did do some emergency airlift out of New Orleans for Katrina, but it wasn't to near that amount of personnel that we had on Operation Allies Refuge. So that was a unique feeling. Once we were airborne out of Kabul, I think probably everybody just had a little bit of adrenaline fatigue and big sigh of relief, and you could kind of just relax a little bit. But there was a sense of accomplishment. We got in and out, we loaded up, we were safe and in the air, headed back to our destination. Downstairs, I think it was exactly the same, because a couple times I looked down, it was to the back of the aircraft. There was just people sleeping everywhere. I could see the Ravens in the back keeping an eye, and our loadmasters were in position, but there was not a lot of movement or anything going on down there.
No. Yeah, no, just to caveat on that, once we got airborne, things kind of, as I alluded to before, they slowed down a bit. You know, that adrenaline fatigue did set in. We had one loadmaster in the very back of the aircraft, and then we had one obviously in the loadmaster station in the front. And, you know, just communicating with them on what they were saying. We were just like, hey, is everything going good back there? And they're like, yeah, everybody's sleeping, just on our way. So, I mean, it was almost interesting, because there's just that sense of calm. It's like, okay, we just did it. We made it out. Everybody's okay. Now the next beast is, how can we get these people on the ground safely? And that was one of the next, I would say, challenges that we faced, was what were the delays going to be? So obviously, you know, fuel was a consideration. We took, I believe it was less fuel just so we could take more passengers, but we also had to have contingency fuel in case we had to hold while they sort things on the ground. Because one of the issues is, you know, in the Middle East, it's very hot, and the airplanes do fairly well. However, they can't maintain 400 plus people and keeping that cargo container cool with that sort of temperature. So one of the, I guess, techniques were to hold as much as we could. That way we could keep the aircraft cool, and then when we were ready, we would come in and land, and then they would figure out the logistics on the ground. But that was obviously what was on our minds next as pilots. Obviously the fatigue factor was settling in. I remember I was nodding at that point, like, okay, I gotta stay awake, and I called bingo on my Monster energy drinks, so I didn't have much left there. But just kind of figuring out what was gonna be next, like when we get on the ground, what are we supposed to do? Because we really didn't have much guidance on what to expect. It was kind of like, hey, you'll park, they'll get the passengers off, and then you're done for the day. And I believe that process ended up taking, I'd say, hours.
Yeah. So once we were airborne, I do remember our flight nurse, Beverly. She was basically crowd surfing downstairs, checking on people, and that's when she handed out all the, small things like baby supplies, some formulas, and some food, and different, fruits and Gatorades that we brought. So I think that helped calm everybody downstairs. And then we just started focusing on getting out of country, conserving our fuel, and getting prepared for our sequence into the Al Udeid Air Base. The sequence for us that night, the way I remember it, correct me if I'm wrong, we did hold for somewhere around 45 minutes to an hour. Right. The aircraft is able to keep cooler at altitude versus on the ground. And then they did clear us to land. They said they had a parking spot for us. And I think that happened fairly smoothly. We got to the parking spot pretty well. We configured the aircraft for maximum cooling that we could, which was still to be using our auxiliary power unit. And I believe one engine is how we set things up that night. And that worked pretty good. The problem was the delay in the buses. So to unload this aircraft with over 400 people, it took about 2 hours and 45 minutes, and there was 9 Greyhound-sized buses that came to and from the aircraft. Each person or family unit, usually deplaned, gathered their stuff, their belongings, and then boarded the bus. So that period of getting off, getting on the ground, and then reboarding another vehicle, it wasn't fast because they traveled in family units. The best I could tell, and security forces was outside assisting in that situation. So yeah, that was our next hurdle, and sometimes things just go your way, and it did take a while, but I think it went pretty smooth for us that night.
It did. I would say once the passengers left, I felt a sense of relief. However, after Colonel Ogle was talking, I then also recall just the chaos on the radios. It's just, even on the ground, people were constantly like, hey, when are we gonna get buses for our passengers? And it's like, and then I specifically remember that there was one particular pilot who was getting fairly upset, which, it wasn't his fault. We were all kind of fatigued and antsy on getting these people off, but then I think we heard that one of the C-17s were carrying the remains of service members who lost their lives, and it kind of put things into perspective where it's like, wow, just completed this thing, but at the same time, some people won't be able to come home to their families, which kind of puts things into perspective. Just like, this went smoothly, yes, but at the same time, service members lost their lives. People who, also volunteered to come out here and help these people lost their lives. And that was something that kind of hit me hard at the time. It kind of, took away from the victory that I had, but it also just, put things into perspective on just the whole big picture on why am I here? So, yeah.
Yeah, once the people left the aircraft, as the aircraft commander, I'm thinking about what are we going to do to take care of our crew? What am I going to do to help get us some rest after being up for, a very long time? And I forget the finer details, but I think we eventually got assigned some rooms, unpacked, got refreshed a little bit, and the sun was probably coming up shortly after that, and made our way for some food and crashed out. And so I think just the sense of everybody was off the aircraft was a sigh of relief, and now just kind of switch more back into the normal mode of taking care of the crew and getting ready for the next assignment.
Right. How did the C-17 perform? C-17 in this operation went above and beyond its duties, and I will say that faithfully to this day forward. It is absolutely one of my favorite aircraft. In terms of running with extreme heat, and I say extreme heat, it performed flawlessly. I mean, there are bumps in the roads and our maintenance issues, but ultimately, we asked it to go in, pull people and equipment out, land and keep doing it until, the mission was complete, and it did that with ease almost, compared to where most aircraft probably would not make it off the ground after, I'd say, one run of going into Kabul. But you know, I'm thankful for it. The aircraft kept me safe. So obviously, I'll always have that sentimental factor. You know, every aircraft that I touched, because it was never the same one. I was like, oh, keep me safe as we go in here. And every time, like, you know, it brought me home.
It was really the backbone of the operation. I don't want to say an exact number, but I want to say there was, you know, 50 to 60 aircraft all out there. So that's almost, you know, what public math here will probably prove me wrong, but a very large percentage of the United States Air Force C-17 fleet was helping out in this effort, and without it, it wouldn't have happened. It couldn't have happened with some of our other airlifters. The sizes, whether it's larger or smaller, we just would not have been able to get the volume of people out of Afghanistan without the C-17. So I think it performed very well.
How did Allies Refuge compare to other operations? Well, for me, fortunately, this was my first major operation, and to what I have to base it off of, it's more recent as the things going on in Ukraine. However, this is drastically different in terms of what we're bringing in terms of what we're doing. And even from speaking from more experienced guys, is that it's something that we have never really done before on this scale. I guess one of the takeaways for me is resiliency, but ultimately like teamwork. That's the one thing I always look back on. I always take back in how we came together as a C-17 community and relied on each other for information and comfort during the time where, you know, we were away from families, and the only family I had were, you know, my fellow pilots, my load masters, my crew chief. And we got together and, you know, we kind of kept each other in check mentally, physically, just so that we can continue to, you know, ultimately complete this mission, come back home to our families, continue on with our lives. But at least for me, from a co-pilot's perspective, the big takeaway was that everybody serves a purpose, and that you don't know everything. You should constantly be learning, refreshing yourself on just some of the most basic knowledge, because, you know, you never know where a small, like, fine detail that you may remember that could potentially, you know, save the aircraft or, you know, ultimately lead to a better solution in a problem. And for that, like, I felt that's only going to advance my airmanship moving forward. I feel much more confident in the way I can carry myself in the future moving on, because ultimately I'll be in Lieutenant Colonel Ogle spot, where I won't be an inexperienced co-pilot. I'll be an instructor pilot, evaluator, and I'll be able to lean back on these previous experiences and say, oh, I've done that before. And let me share with you how we were able to combat this issue by doing this. This may not be something that you do in the book, but, you know, you got to get creative, and that's through systems knowledge, through training, which is invaluable, and the things that we do at home. That way, ultimately, when we do go and, you know, partake in an operation in the Middle East, it all starts to click, and it's like, okay, I've done this before. This is what we need to do. But ultimately, you know, seeking advice from others. It doesn't matter what experience level they are, somebody always has some sort of feedback that can contribute to a personal factor. And that's ultimately what I got out of OAR, and I find most valuable compared to the other operation that I've been a part of, even though I've been a part of 2 at this time.
First, let me just kind of touch on some of the similarities. You know, the fog of war is real. There's always going to be confusion for you, Lieutenant Anderson, out there, and you got to see that. It won't always be the same chaos or fog, but that factor is there. We had a pretty clear mission on what to do, so that sounds pretty normal. We'll have clear missions in the future. Sometimes how you accomplish those missions will be the deciding factor of the day. You'll have support of our commands. They supported this. The Air Mobility Command, in my opinion, were the true heroes, and they threw 110% at this operation. And that kind of left us a little bit limited with some of the other tools at our disposal for this. So once we got the operation underway, we've got aircrew, we've got airplanes, but some of those other logistical things were just not there. So that was different for me, where we were waiting on a fuel truck, we were waiting on a bus driver, the ability to clean and turn an aircraft. The people on the ground were already at, their longest shifts that they could handle. So had it been more planned, scheduled, more support equipment, personnel in place, then I think it would have gone smoother. So, but that's not to say any of the other humanitarian efforts I've been a part of, there's always that chaos factor. And so this one had a lack of logistical support, ground support for being able to move. And people did pivot as fast as they could to find beds for the refugees across multiple bases in the Middle East, which was really just awesome to see. So I think another thing that this operation was different was really just how it started. It was so unexpected, from an aircraft arriving on a regular scheduled mission to the airfield being overrun and them leaving with refugees. That was not the plan. That was not the plan. So by the time that had happened and the time we got there, I think this was probably 7 to 10 days later.
Yep.
I forget the exact dates.
It was about that time.
But yeah, maybe 11 days later. And then it was done, in another 5-6 days after that. Right. So we made the two more trips after we flew the refugees out. And a lot of times with humanitarian efforts, Jalen, you'll see that they're pretty quick and they're done.
Yep.
I would just wish that we'd have had a little bit more heads up in this to properly prepare. Another aspect of this operation that is unique and different, and this is probably the hardest one to talk about for many people, is the amount of time and effort, lives that were put into Afghanistan to see it go in this direction. It weighed a lot on many service members. So that's probably the hardest thing for this operation for me, is just to see it go after so long to this outcome. And it echoes back to the way Vietnam ended. And that hit hard on a lot of people because their dad served in Vietnam. So I've, flown around the world, participated in several humanitarian efforts, but a hurricane, a typhoon, a nuclear reactor melting down, it didn't hit home like this one hit home to our service members. Yeah. That's the best answer I got for you, Doctor. An observation that I made, like I said earlier, as a squadron commander at the time, and I was flying with one of our newest lieutenants, Lieutenant Jalen Anderson, and the training that he got at pilot training and at our formal training unit out in Altus, Oklahoma, the way those instructors trained him and the way that the instructors here at the 301st Airlift Squadron trained him, I was just so amazed and thankful that he was on board to share that, the freshest amount of skill and experience from our finest instructors that you got the privilege to work with for the last really 2.5, 3 years of your life before this unfolded. It was just a testament, not only to your hard work and skill, but I think to all of their effort, to all of the upcoming pilots. So that's very encouraging to me as someone sitting over here with lots of gray hair to know how well they are doing to produce a pilot in the U.S. Air Force.
Right. No, just piggybacking off of that, it's to get to this point, I look back at where I started, and if you had told me back in 2014 where I took my first flight on a Cessna 172 that I'd be flying a C-17 into Afghanistan and flying individuals out on a, a humanitarian airlift mission, I would not have believed you. Like, just to see my role in this big picture, like, I feel so small, but like looking back at it, it's just amazing what all the training, all the hard work, the nights where I was restless thinking, oh man, am I actually gonna earn these wings that I have on my chest because I couldn't stay in formation today and I got yelled at the whole time. Like, it's interesting because I always go back to one of these all-calls we had during pilot training. The wing commander at the time, he was saying, and I even shared this on an interview I did prior to going to OAR, he's like, you'll never know when you're gonna be called to do something in this career. You may think it's gonna be years from now when you're, got some experience under the belt, whatever airframe you're gonna be flying. But he's like, that's not how it works out in the Air Force. You're gonna be brand new and flying your first mission, and you're gonna sit there and say, wow, how did I end up here? And that is exactly what happened. I mean, not even a year under my belt, I'm sitting here flying into Afghanistan, and what is assuming like a major historical event, and yeah, I'm having to rely on all the training up to that point to execute a task. And I'm really just glad that the amount of instructors, like the instruction that's poured into me, the experiences that I've had, the failures that I've had, the biggest takeaway is that I have learned to embrace failure, because that's ultimately what gives me the confidence to move forward and to perform to the best of my abilities. Because that's the only time you're going to learn. I mean, you can't be perfect. There's no perfect pilot. I don't think there's any end goal. And like, I've learned everything I need to know about aviation, because at the end of the day, you're going to be thrown a curveball where you're going to be asked to do something that maybe has not been done before. And you're going to have to rely on the skills in which you work on to, I guess, complete the task. And that's been my biggest takeaway. And I mean, moving forward, this is something that I will always be able to look back on, that I can share with those who are under me, because I never know, the next Jalen, what he's going to be faced, fresh out of pilot training, and I'm going to be able to, take this experience and then mentor to youth and say like, hey, like, you'll never know when you're called to perform a task, and you're going to have to rely on the things that you've learned, and you're just ultimately going to have to suck it up and do it. That's the best way I can put it.
All right, well, thank you, Jim.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll throw one more out there for you, Doctor, if we have time. Biggest takeaway for me from being a part of this operation and seeing it from multiple levels was really just so encouraging to see how people step forward and want to help other people. They have the spirit of love and kindness in their hearts. Even though sometimes we carry firearms and are in the military, the reason that this was a success was because people do love to take care of people. And I saw that I think we were on the road for 26 days. And every single day I saw somebody taking care of somebody, whether it was on our crew, in the back of the aircraft, weighing a piece of cargo to come on board, watching our load masters downstairs being so professional with a situation that they'd never been trained on. We were playing PA, public announcements, over our speakers to help calm people and assure them that things were going to be okay in a language that we don't speak. Yeah. Ultimately, just, that was the best part about this whole thing, was seeing how much, whether it was the person at the command post, running the fuel truck, loading cargo, loading a flight plan, the big team just really came together and showed that they do care about people all around the